Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji. Welcome back to the Deconstructed Woman podcast. So today I wanted to present this conversation to Joji and have a little bit of back and forth after I recently finished the book Good Inside by Dr. Becky Kennedy. This book is specifically looking at parenting, but I think as I finished it, and especially the conclusion of the book, I felt like it is applicable to all facets of life. And the premise of this, and Dr. Kennedy talks about the fact that this is really a movement in some ways, is that we're all good inside and that we can have kind of this two things are true at the same time, that we're still good inside, we're still good people, but we can still do things that we're not proud of or that kind of reflects kind of the bad, if you will, or the darker side of each of us. And so I thought that this is an interesting conversation because I think that in my parenting journey, I'm always looking for different parenting books and things like that. But I think that it brings the reality of the fact that Lucy's here with me, that, that we can make mistakes and we can do things that we're not proud of, but we're still good. And I think that that's a hard concept sometimes. And we talked about like parent guilt or just guilt in general, how that affects people, how that pans out. And I think that a lot of times it's hard to know, that you are still good, even in light of that. So, Joji, I'm going to hand it over to you because I know that you had kind of done a little bit of research on this. And kind of let's start off with what was your initial thoughts when you heard this concept of being two things at once and not necessarily one or the other?
The first thing that went through my mind was how hard it is for most people to keep opposite ideas together at the same time. In the sense of, I think, society sort of waters things down to this or that, good or bad, black and white. And so I think that that's the first thing that occurred to me is sort of like, how in certain ways, there's a complexity to being able to have two realities that are polar opposites of each other and still know that you're not all one way or the other, and how easy it is to see it as one or the other. And so that's what really led me to doing some research and finding out, what's out there about this conversation. And you can take lots of different this particular topic in terms of being able to know that you are good inside regardless of some of the bad decisions or choices or actions that you may have had doesn't have to define you. That whole concept has lots of different ways you can go into it. You can go into it philosophically, you can go it religiously, spiritually, you can go into it as a paradigm of life. There's a whole Buddhist philosophy about it. And so there's lots of different ways that I saw that people sort of understand this idea. But at the core of it, I think that a lot of it has to do with not psyching yourself out because you make a mistake or a bad decision, or even maybe a series of bad actions because you are emotional or something got out of hand. We are set up in our society to feel like that makes us bad and it diminishes the good that we feel. Whereas I feel that if you accept the bad, understand that that was a moment of time, that was one interaction, one action in a series of actions or in your day, your week, your life, that it's really a very small part of what makes you you and not to get stuck there. So that's what I initially thought. Is that sort of the conversation you want to have, Alyssa?
Yeah, and I think that that goes along with Dr. Kennedy's concept because her concept is, again, from a parenting perspective, that your child's not trying to be bad. They're not trying to push your buttons, manipulate, all the things that I think that we readily kind of go to. They're just struggling in that moment, and the concept is to become more curious rather than punitive, or, come from a blaming perspective. And I think that that's definitely counter to a lot of times, I think, how I have parented and how I have viewed things. Because I think a lot of times, you see a child hitting another child and you're thinking, well, that kid's bad. Like, that kid didn't know, what he was, or, not that he didn't know what he was doing, but like he's doing that on purpose. Like, that's very specific kind of behavior. But her premise is that child's struggling, something's going on for them, and you have to figure out what that is. And then she translated that to parents and adults and said, you know what, if you yell at your kids and you do things that you're not proud of, you were struggling in that moment, not you're a bad parent. And so again, I think that that translates to how people, so I think it goes right along with what you were saying as well. But I think that it also is common in the workplace, that if you make mistakes, doesn't make you a bad employee. That just means you were struggling, or you had, this one incident, or I mean, obviously if it's multiple incidents, maybe it's a different discussion, but we're all essentially trying to do our best with what we have, and that's not something that we should focus our attention on. We should focus on making changes, trying to do better, but we can be both of those things at the same time. You can still make mistakes and still be good inside. And I think that that's the concept that kind of struck me, especially, as I'm trying to make changes in my parenting style and how I approach my kids. That's something that I'm like, I have to sit back and pause, because I don't know that I always give myself the grace I need to as well. I think sometimes I'm harder on myself because, oh, I yelled again. So like now we're just, gone back to ground zero, and it's saying, you know what, that I was struggling in that moment. That's okay. I'm still an okay parent. I'm still an okay person. And I think that that's something that we're all trying to work towards.
Yeah, I think that in addition to that, you've talked, about the work that you're doing. And as a parent, as we all do when we're parenting and we feel like we want to, I mean, we all have sort of, in my growing up, it was, Mrs. Brady from the Brady Bunch, like she was like the perfect mom. And, it never seemed like she had any conflicts with any of her children. And I doubt that that was true in all the episodes, but that's just the way that that reputation was. And so we hold ourselves to a really high standard. And in the reading that I did, what I really found over and over again was being able to do two things. I think the first thing is, giving yourself the grace, or being able to know that this is just one part of you and this action doesn't represent all of you. And so, not that gloom and doom assumption. But the other part of it is also doing the work so that it doesn't become a repeating pattern. Because we all know people that excuse all their behavior. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, things happen that get out of control. And at some point, the only way to move away from that is to accept that that happened. But then part of that solution is also making sure that you're working on it not happening again, because then that becomes sort of a self fulfilling prophecy, and it will continue to happen because you're not really if you continue, if we're not talking about excusing the behavior, we're talking about understanding the behavior and working on eliminating the behavior. But, parenting is a different thing. It's a very difficult thing to talk about because I feel like we don't talk about the good times as much as we only focus on the hard times. And so that I think is a challenge because I know you well enough to know as a parent that you treasure the beautiful moments that you have with your child, as I did with my child. But what sometimes I remember are the hardships and how things didn't go well, or the times where I will always say, when I've said it before on this podcast, the only time I ever really physically struck Neela, my daughter, was when she was a year and a half old and pulling at the Christmas tree. And I thought it was going to fall on her. And I kept saying, no, don't do that. Trying to use my patience with her, trying to tell her course, she's a year and a half. She's not understanding a lot of what I'm saying. And I got so frustrated that I, sort of slapped her hand lightly, not hard or anything. And she burst out in tears, and I burst out in tears because she was crying. And then, here we both are just crying. And it was not good for anybody. And clearly that made an impression on me because here, 26 years later, I'm still talking about it. And it's because I think those are the memories that we have that we use to rate ourselves. And the fact that, I mean, literally in 28 years, that's the only time that that happens is really a fantastic idea. I mean, that's a great thing, and the fact that, for the best of my memory, that's the only time that I felt like I had resorted to, even mild kinds of, physical touch in a negative way. I wouldn't never ever say corporal punishment or anything like that because I don't believe in that per se. But like that, I never wanted to use any kind of a physical touch in a negative way when I was dreaming about being a parent. And so my point only is that we focus on what we do poorly when clearly the majority of the time, we spend doing joyful, loving, nurturing, embracing our children and things like that. And so I do feel like we're really hard on ourselves, and we have to remember that this is just a space of time. And that's the other thing about it. Kids are difficult, for certain ages that we all know about. They're usually when they're nonverbal and they can't communicate, or they don't know how to express themselves and they don't have the words to be able to share their emotions. And, usually in adolescence when they're overwhelmed with hormones and they don't know where they fit in the world and that they don't know what's going on with their bodies, and they're just overwhelmed. And those are times that you have to give yourself some grace because all bets are sort of off, and so I do think that there are just some periods of time where these things happen, and it feels like it's just an accumulation, and that can be hard as a parent or as an employer or as a boss or as a, preceptor with a student that maybe isn't working out well. I mean, these are all times that are really, really challenging, but they're very specific instances. You can't use a broad brush and just sort of say it was all bad, which I think is the way we in society tend to think. And I think that's what makes life more challenging.
Yeah, and I'm lost for the type of fallacy that it is, but I know that there's I would try to look it up, but my phone will probably glitch. So in the interest of not glitching for this recording, I wasn't able to look it up real quick. But I know that there's a fallacy where like we see the good in other people even when they make mistakes. So if a coworker made a mistake, you might say to them, "Oh, well, that was just an oversight on your part." But when we make the mistake, we almost globalize it to, I'm a bad person. And I think that that's something that does happen for us a lot of times where we, compliment somebody and, think, that's they're a good person or they're such a kind person, but somebody gives us a similar compliment and we say, well, it was just in that one moment. So again, there's kind of this concept of kind of short sighting and not giving ourselves a full credit of things that we do that are good, but instead kind of like you were saying before, like we focus on that negative. And I think that that's maybe in some ways just human behavior, how we look at things. But I think that it makes it taints kind of the waters of how we view ourselves and how you get out of that cycle of making those changes like you were talking about. I think that a lot of times we aren't able to make changes because we constantly think, oh, I'm not making any progress. So what's the point? And I give up. I'm never going to get to whatever it is. Like if it's weight loss, for example, oh, I mean, I've been on many weight loss journeys in the last 40 years. And, I go strong for a while, then I kind of lose interest or think like, I'm not really seeing the progress or I plateau, whatever it is. And it's like, well, I'm never going to get there. And so I kind of give up. And, it takes me a couple of months and then I get back on the bandwagon and try again. And I think that, I've tried a lot of different programs and I think that it's one of those things where you have to kind of give yourself those small wins to be able to say, I'm still, I'm making progress. I'm doing something good, even if it's just you're changing one habit. I mean, that's what we've seen when they talk about like habit stacking and things like that. Like making changes to get to your goals takes time, but it also takes small baby steps. And I think that a lot of times we're just like, well, I can't do this, so I'm not going to try because I'm not good at this or I'm not. We've talked about how people who are successful get there. So I know we had that conversation. We always somehow link back to past episodes. But, I think that there are ways of viewing that and recognizing that we are at the end of the day doing the best that we can. And so that's going to come up a couple more times, I'm sure, in this conversation. But the reason I'm saying it multiple times is because somebody out there might need to hear that. Somebody might need to hear you're doing the best that you can, whether that be at work, on a weight loss journey and parenting, whatever it is. It's you can be both things. You can be failing and still succeeding. And I think that that's something that we don't always acknowledge because that seems, but I hear that so many times from so many people who, did fail, but they were failing and that got them closer to succeeding.
Yeah, and I'm having two thoughts while you were talking. One of them is that the bar is set so high that I feel like the things that most of us do are so minimal that, in the big scheme of things, what we're talking about, even I know the yelling is something that really gets under your skin and that you don't wanna do that to raise your children, Alyssa, but I'm thinking about, like, how when you think about the worst case scenario and how children are raised and what children need and how resilient they are and everything else. I mean, we give our kids a really good life, and our intention is to do right by them. And I think that that's such an important piece to it all. Number one, the fact that if the worst thing in the world that your kids got, and I know this is not going to be true, is yelling from their mom as she's trying to keep all these different priorities in her head. I just remember talking to my daughter as she was going to college and just saying, like, was your childhood okay? Like, I just wanted some validation. And she was like, yeah, like, I'm all good. Like, life is good. And I think that we as parents just are so worried about being a working mom and, you know, trying to do too many things and giving attention to every child and, you know, mother and son time together and mother daughter time together and a special time for every child that you have to, I mean, we just have put so many demands on us to be perfect that I feel like we forget the fact that kids are really resilient and it's going to take a lot more than yelling at your child to be called a bad mom under most of society's, thought process. And so, I mean, that's the first thing. The other thought that I had as you were talking, Alyssa, was sort of the idea of, what is darkness and what is light? People say that darkness is the absence of light or light is the absence of darkness. And I guess what I'm getting with that idea is the fact that you really don't understand one without the other. And I don't exactly know what the point is that I'm trying to make about that, besides the fact that would we know what is good if we didn't have some bad? And, also to help that keep us in balance and to know that that's just the nature of things. I mean, that's just the way it is, and that we can't expect to be all good, even though those are the false expectations that people, society put on us. But truthfully, to be real, that's just not possible. And so I think that that was also something that came to mind when you were talking, about what was on your mind and how you were seeing things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's such a good example. And I know that we were just recently having that conversation from, one of our book club books. But I think that that concept is such a good one. Lucy wants to jump into the conversation too. But I think that, we have this duality, but at the same time, we also need to recognize that we can be both, and that's okay.
So I think that that's a really, I mean, that is, I hope that that's what we are sharing with our listeners is that, we have to fight the urge to put ourselves in one bucket or another bucket. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, if we survive our day and our psyche is intact and that we haven't done anyone real harm, then I think that we have done the best we could for that day. And I think for our listeners, it's important to realize that as much as the world wants us to choose one lane or the other, you got to remember that there is no solid white and solid black, there's only gray. And so those of us who are comfortable with the gray find it a lot easier, I think, to forgive ourselves. And I think that if you force yourself to be in one or the other, I think that's where you have, anxiety or you have depression or you have other things that are going on that make life very difficult because the reality is that that's not easy to maintain 24/7. You have to realize that, there's fluctuations during the days and things are going to happen, and there's fluctuations as we are women with hormones and, whether you're pregnant, whether you're sometime during your cycle, whether you're, in perimenopause, postmenopause, whatever it is, as women specifically based on our bodies, there's a lot of variation with hormones that is very clearly correlated with our emotion and our behavior. And so I think for so many reasons, we have to be able to step back and just realize that either we need some help or it's not as bad as we think it is and don't catastrophize, what's going on. And to be able to look back and recenter yourself and give yourself, a little bit more of a judgment from a more neutral stance. And I think the other piece that's also really important is that it's key that we accept this of ourselves. I think sometimes when you give it voice, you can also work to decrease it. So one of the articles I was reading was, a gentleman was talking about the fact that he and his wife, found out that they were pregnant and he didn't really feel like he was financially ready to have a baby, and he was sort of beating himself up about it and just thought like, I wanted a better job, I thought we would be in a house, I thought I'd be making this much money or we would have this much savings. And so he was just devastated, whereas usually having finding out you're pregnant is usually a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful thing for him, but quickly his mind went to how he was inept at that and how could he do that. And so he talked about his progression through that, that situation. And what he said was accepting what it is like today and what is realistic for me to do now that I've got 7 or 8 months before this baby is born to be able to set some goals and to know that I'm working towards a better life for my child gave him the ability to take a breath and to say, things happen, this is what I can do in 9 months or 7 months. And what am I going to get to do there? And he said that surrendering to that, just admitting that this is his reality, not getting overly anxious because that would paralyze him from doing anything different, but just being able to acknowledge it, give it a name, and say, okay, so now how do we move forward? Really gave him the opportunity to leave that in the rearview mirror and move forward and get excited about having this baby because he knew that he was going to be at a different place in 7 months and that he was going to do his level best to create the home he wanted for his child. And so I think that there's a lot of beautiful truths in there. And I hope that many people can relate to, that example because I thought it was a really good one. Any thoughts about that, Alyssa?
Yeah, I really love that example because I think that so many times in life people say like, "Oh, this is a the blessing and a curse," or this is like I think that there is that kind of finite experience of this thing is happening to me and there's not much that I can do about it. I think that there's so many examples that come to mind, but I leave it open ended for the listener who's maybe fill in the blanks of what maybe you're experiencing or, a hardship. But I think that there is kind of that ability to say, okay, this is happening, but I also have the ability to pivot out of this. I have the ability to like you were describing with the gentleman, like make goals, change some things and to embrace it. And again, it's kind of that dual understanding of the world of I think really what this comes down to is accepting the gray, accepting that it's not just one thing, it can be both things, but it also isn't just, one and done. Okay, I'm all good, I'm all bad. This is, I can't handle this, whatnot. I think that it's really about accepting that there is gray in the circumstances that we experience and being able to accept that and, make pivot from that because I think that so often we say, well, this is I'm just a bad person. I can do no right. And I think that once you get into that mentality and once you stay in that stuck area, and we've talked about being unstuck, I think that, that however that applies to you, that's a place that's really hard to get out of because you've created that stuckness. I don't know if that's a word, but like you've created that those four walls around you instead of breaking down those barriers and saying, okay, how can I move forward?
And I wanted to actually give the name of this author just because we did talk a little bit about him. His name is Matt Valentine, and he is part of or the owner of this website called Tiny Buddha Simple Wisdom for Complex Lives. And the article that I am referencing is How Accepting the Bad Can Lead to Joy and Growth. And so I think it really, in certain ways is not exactly the way we started out this conversation about Dr. Kennedy talking about, the parts of us that are good and that we are good. But I also feel like there's another side to it, which is acknowledging the bad will also lead to good and understanding what that process looks like. And so I really liked the article and it really made me sit and think a little bit about what approach he took with it. And so I don't know. I'm ready to sort of close this conversation out. It always amazes me, Alyssa, when we come up with a topic and we're like, oh, well, wait and see how this goes. This was a great conversation, and I hope that the listeners got something out of it. Are there any final words you'd like to say before I close us out?
No, I'll let you go right ahead and kind of close this episode. But as always, we always want people to take this and run with it and find how this applies to you, and hopefully it's been helpful.
Yeah, I feel like it has done, if nothing else, given me some inspiration to give myself some grace. And so I think that that's always a wonderful thing as a woman when we can step back and say, yeah, you know what? The big scheme of things, everything is pretty good. It also ties to gratitude and being present and all the other principles that we talk about on a regular basis on this podcast. But as Alyssa mentioned, we'd love to hear from you. Give us examples of things that are relevant in your life that you've overcome. If you're willing to share that on our Facebook page, the Deconstructed Woman Facebook location, as well as the deconstructedwoman at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, we're interested in your input and for ideas for other podcast series. So, please let us know what you're thinking. And for now, we'll say goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.